All right. I'll just kick it off. We've been talking a lot with our partners about, the recent Connelly decision in the Supreme Court and its effect on business succession planning. You've been in this business for so many years and want to just get your thoughts about its impact on, business succession planning and estate planning.
This for the buy-sell agreement, the Connelly case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what happened is the two brothers, they bought insurance for the company. Michael died, and he went and filed his final tax return. He got audited from an estate tax point of view. The service came in and said the $3 million of life insurance should be includable. He filed a return at $3.86 million. They then said the $3 million is includable and went to the district court, and then it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The premise behind this is there are a lot of different techniques that you can use. I would recommend either a cross-purchase buy-sell agreement where you're buying insurance on your brother and he's buying insurance on you. And then you get a step up in basis because if one person dies, they're actually buying out your interest and you get a step up in basis. But the thing that's really important is you got to review that buy-sell agreement every few years. Because as your business is growing, you're going to have to adjust the amount of insurance you're putting on the plan if you want to have a true buyout. So if you're 50-50 partners, or if you have 4 partners and you 25% each, or whatever the number is, you should always have the other partner buy the insurance on you and vice versa. It's called a cross-purchase plan. There are a lot of different plans you can use, but that's the simplest and easy one to use.
Well, at what point in a business's life cycle have you started helping, or do you recommend businesses to start thinking about this?
I'm going to say at time of setup, you need to start thinking about this. If you have partners and the business is built that way, you've got to have a mechanism to be able to have an ease if something, God forbid, happens, someone dies or becomes disabled. You really need to be thinking about this planning as you're setting up the business. I highly recommend if you're starting a new entity with someone, you should have parameters and build out a scope of a document and work with a law firm, because I think it's truly important to understand that. I'll give you a perfect example because this happened the other day, and I think this is a great case that we could talk about. Friend came to my office. Father and brother are business partners. Father's 68 years old. The uncle is 71. They don't have a buy-sell agreement. The business is worth over $100 million. Plus, the father doesn't have a will. So he is an at-will in New York. So God forbid something happens to his brother who doesn't have a will either. The state then decides how the disposition of assets are going to be moved. I truly believe if you do estate planning and you look at your business, planning, you will give you peace of mind that you know that the transition will be done expeditiously. Using insurance in this mechanism really ties it all together. But you've got to review these things every couple of years.
Right. And I've heard you say one of my favorite sayings is everybody has an estate plan. The default one is the government's. So,
Correct.
Talk about what happens if you don't have any of these plans in place, the impact of state tax.
Well, let's look at some famous people. Let's look at Prince. Let's look at the guy from The Sopranos. They didn't have wills. So the government comes in and they make all the decisions. And if you have young kids, you better have a will set up because the state can appoint the kids to someone else. They don't know what your intended wishes are. Look, I always say it's about peace of mind. Everything you do has to be about peace of mind. I know mortality is a tough issue to face. And I know it's something that if you really think it through properly, go hire an estate planning attorney, work with, a subject matter expert on the insurance stuff. Understand that you need to put a plan together because I will use Mike Tyson's quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And there are always what ifs. Look, no one ever forecasts what's going to happen. I just think you got to plan and plan properly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you never know what lies around the corner. The only thing guaranteed is right now. Right. So you always have to plan against that. And talk about, when a lot of the common types of permanent life insurance that you use in business succession planning, right? What what are the common patterns or the, specific products that you see perform most successful, or is it about your goals?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's more about goal planning. I don't want to really tap into the insurance ecosystem here. It's really understanding what you're trying to accomplish for the business, what you're trying to accomplish for your family. I'll give you a perfect opportunity that I worked on many years ago. Very wealthy family, real estate and the automobile business. One son was in the business. The brother and sister were not in the business. And the father said, I've got to build some type of an equalization. I got to make something where I know I'm going to take care of the brother and sister. Mom is all set. I'm all set. And my son, who's in the business, said, look, Dad, I have an unbelievable relationship with my brother and sister. I don't think it's fair that they didn't want to come into the family business. Let's create a plan that creates cohesion. The business was worth $300 million. The father and son had a buy-sell agreement, so they took care of that aspect of it. They did it in a cross purchase, so the Connelly would not have had any effects. And then they said, we want to create an estate plan. So mom and dad bought what's called a second and die policy, and they bought, a very large policy to make sure that the brother and sister had equalization, and it was one half family. See, I think the dynamic around family-owned businesses is very complicated, especially if kids are not in the business. I can hear your story about how I got this black mark on my eye because I was dealing with a family many years ago where the son was just like, Dad, I don't want to take care of my brother. Can't stand him. He does not deserve anything. And the father said, we have no choice. We have to do it. So look, I always say, sit, build the purpose around what you're trying to accomplish, and then let the professionals help engage. But you must review these plans every several years. Don't set it and forget it. It is the worst thing to do because then you don't remember what the hell you're doing.
Underestimate its value and overestimate its cost is because they think it only works for the death benefit, when in reality you're accomplishing so many things at once.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue to another point I want to make. Is I think the interest set is really key. And I think the objective is to get people to understand how these policies work, how the different subsets work. You could take a very fixed income approach, or you could take a balanced approach, or you could take an aggressive approach. You could design a policy to meet your goals, and your goals change also. So people who bought insurance between the years of 1990 and 2014, if they haven't reviewed their policies, you must do it. Because maybe you've gotten a lot richer. Maybe you don't need the cash accumulation. Maybe it's more a protection product. You got to really think through what your goals are. It's not, we talked about this before, it's not a set it and forget it asset class.
Right. We got Mike Doniger here, CIO of Optifino, ex-Citadel, ex-hedge fund guy, our big data modeler. And so, his time is valuable, so we want to get to it. With the upcoming presidential election, obviously there's conversations around tax rates, what that might be for the Democrats or the Republicans. Specific interest is capital gains and has been the last few elections. Kamala has suggested raising it to 33%, which is a bit lower than Biden's administration would have proposed. And so we want to get into, in what ways might we insulate ourselves for varying tax rates in the coming decade, in the coming years, right? And so we love permanent life insurance here. So, we want to talk about how can investors strategically navigate capital gains taxes across changing administrations with tailored permanent life.
Great. I think whether it's this election or any election or just general trends, we have been under what some people call a tax holiday for many, many years now. And the idea just fundamentally, as we think about long periods of time, which insurance encompasses long periods of time, depending on how old you are, do you fundamentally believe the taxes are going to be higher 10, 20, 30 years from now or lower? And as you think about that, if you believe that they're going to be higher, then you are more prone to want to do tax mitigation strategies, just generically speaking. And so permanent life insurance is obviously our favorite tax mitigation strategy. And that is because the death benefit in insurance is tax deferred and tax free. And so we can use certain types of policies, and we'll go into them, that are designed to hold the amount of risk that you would want in your portfolio in a tax efficient way. If we take kind of a very simple and extreme case of owning the S&P, right? And so if we wanted to own the S&P in our portfolio and we bought it as a young man or a young woman, and it was $100,000, make it up. And then through the compounding over time, you never sold it. You never paid much taxes except for maybe some dividends and things like that. It compounded to $10 million, right? And it came time to sell it, you would have a massive capital gains problem. And if you believe capital gains are going up, it's going to be even more massive. And so how can you mitigate that event? Well, there is something called universal life, and particularly variable universal life, which is a insurance structure that allows you to allocate the capital to an ETF or a variety of ETFs that represent that same type of risk, but that can compound themselves. And then when the policy ends, the person passes, that death benefit is tax-free. Furthermore, like if you ever wanted to access that capital, in the case of the S&P, you would sell it and you would pay the taxes at that time. But the way a variable universal life policy works is because that capital sits on the carrier, within the carrier and the sub-account of the carrier, and it's not yours, you can borrow against that policy. They remove the risk from the market. You get charged a loan and you get credited back a loan because it's your capital, and essentially it's usually around 0 or 1% to borrow that money. And in theory, you can now redeploy that capital or pull that capital and never have any tax consequences, which introduces kind of a next concept, and I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, of portfolio turn. When your financial advisor, shows you a portfolio, he doesn't say there's zero taxes in that portfolio, but he also doesn't say there's full capital gains, because you're owning pieces of that portfolio for longer periods of time. You're slowly turning over that portfolio. And so we generally try to model something like 20-25% tax load when comparing an insurance product to a traditional type of investment.
Right. And when it comes to the cost of insurance and what you're paying these carriers, how does that factor in over time? At what point might it become more beneficial to have your money in a policy versus just giving directly to an advisor, if ever?
Yeah, well, definitely if ever. The generically speaking, the younger you are and the healthier you are, the cheaper insurance is going to be. And so when we look at the cost of insurance inside these products, they can be as low as 50 basis points. So meaning that if the underlying asset is making 8, you're compounding at 7.5. And if you think about that versus a 25% tax load, that would be 8 versus 6%. So you're kind of making 1.5%, 7.5 versus 6 in that scenario. As you get older and less healthy, that obviously gets higher and higher and higher. If we took a generic 45, 50-year-old that's in pretty good health, that's probably creeping towards 80 to 100 bips. And as you got towards someone who's, say, 70, 75, you're going to get to where the cost of insurance is just too high at that point,
Right. That makes sense. So the key lesson, start when you're younger, really applies here.
The power of compounding, as Warren Buffett said, is the eighth wonder of the universe, right? And so the longer you have it, the general rule of sevens, at 7%, money doubles every 7 years. And if you just think about that, if you could live 49 years, that's 7 doubles. I can't do the math, but 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. So every dollar becomes $64. It's super, 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 super powerful. That's obviously over a very, very long period of time. The problem when you're younger is you don't have as much money, generically speaking. And so but if you can start with $5,000, $10,000 a year, or when you're in your 20s, it turns out to be just a gargantuan amount of money as you get towards retirement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that leads itself well into the next question of generational wealth, right? If you're thinking not just for yourself, but for your kids and for the future, and what that might be for what you can set up and insulate as far as the state tax goes, especially knowing the Trump estate taxes are set to expire in 2026. And so, how do you start to insulate yourself from that with permanent life?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of literature on what's about to happen on December 31st, 2025. Again, we've been under this tax holiday, and the Act Tax Act of 2017 has granted an ever increasing with inflation lifetime exemption, which is now at record highs, projected to be with 13.4 million or something, $13.3 million in 24 and 25. And so for a couple, that's over $27 million to take advantage of. And it's, most people would say that it's going to drop to 7 million each. So from 27 million to 14 million. And then who knows under what regime it's going to happen going forward. It's been, when I was younger, it was $1 million, and so if you have a decent amount of wealth, and not even just today, if you think you're going to have a decent amount of wealth in the future, because even if you only have, and that, I say only, and I don't mean that by any means, but if you have $10 million in your account today, you need to start doing tax planning and moving that down, because like we just did, the law of doubles, 10 million today could be worth 100 million, later on. So this isn't necessarily, this is proper trust and estate tax planning, moving that money out of your estate and down to other taxes. Where permanent life insurance comes into play here is, as you're moving that money, it becomes a very good structure to have inside these trusts. And so remember, we were talking about before, the compounding of money inside of anywhere, eventually there's capital gains taxes. So, but insurance insulates that. So if you were to move money out of your estate into a trust and put that in an insurance wrapper, let it grow, then when you pass, the death benefit kicks in inside the trust, and you have a step up in basis in theory inside the trust, i.e. there's no capital gains because the death benefit kicks in. So combining those two together, good trust and estate planning with proper insurance wrappers and vehicles in there, is a super powerful vehicle for hyper efficient tax planning.
Right. And obviously you mentioned if you only or not if you only have 10 million. At what point does it start making sense for people to think about planning for trust and estate, own life insurance? Is there certain levels of wealth that you recommend?
I mean, I think planning for being over the federal exemption on trust and estate on taxes means you're very wealthy. You're already talking about the top percent of the population at that point. I don't know, holistically speaking, if you're sitting, depending on your age, on close to $10 million, that could easily push yourself over the exemption going forward. And then, life is long. Like these things go in cycles, and, there's been a time in this country where we had a 90% effective income tax rate, and so who knows what the future holds. You take advantage of what you can take now. The real disadvantage to trust and estate planning, well, one, it's somewhat costly to get lawyers to do all that type of work. And two, some people worry about the liquidity, taking all that liquidity out of my own hands and giving it to my heirs. There are, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to, so you need to speak to your own tax advisor, but there are vehicles like SLATs and other types of trusts where you can still have access to that capital. So just getting a really good advice from a really good trust and estate lawyer and finding your needs is paramount in all of this kind of stuff. But yeah, I think you're talking about somebody who, as a couple or an individual, is getting towards those high millions to tens of millions of dollars. When you learn about that, separately speaking, so that's just for trust and estates, right? For compounding money tax free over time, that's everybody's game, right? And that is a super powerful vehicle that everybody uses. That everybody uses, that a lot of wealthy people use to have hyper efficient use of your capital and investments.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard us throw around the term high earner, not rich yet, the Harrys of the world, right? If you're that, you could start thinking about the VUL policies and planning for a family, for example. It might make sense to start thinking about VUL policies.
Yeah, I mean, we're really big fans around here of the VUL structure. It is, if you want that type of risk, I mean, that's the amazing feature. But like, if you're going to allocate a portion of your investment portfolio to basically index like S&P, NASDAQ type risk, we believe some of that should be in an efficient insurance structure. The There are other types of insurance policies like whole life, index universal life, et cetera, that are interesting policies that contain less risk. But in its purest form, owning an ETF wrap will have the lowest fees, generically speaking. Those 50 basis points we were talking about before, because essentially the least complex. It doesn't have. I think what I think about when I think about insurance is the more bells and whistles you hear around something, generically, the more expensive it's going to be. Not to say that they're not bells and whistles, and you might not want those bells. But if you're literally saying, how do I get the purest representation of the S&P 500? You're going to try to find a variable policy from a carrier that likes variable policies, which there can be a wide spectrum, which is why we obviously examine all the different carriers. Wants to be in the market for that specific age, health, sex, etc. And then we also go down and look at the fees of what they charge for the ETFs in the underlying asset. And it's gotten very, very, very competitive over the last couple of years. And we're seeing pure fees for making up a Vanguard equity ETF, which is essentially the S&P, as low as 13, 14 basis points, which is completely on par or better than you're going to get at any financial advisor or RIA, that's charging more than just a pure fee.
Yeah, and you mentioned whole life, and just to briefly touch on that, the most conservative, let's say conventional wisdom is 60-40 stock bonds. Warren Buffett's a 90-10. Yeah, how do you think about whole life within your larger portfolio and how much you want to allocate towards that?
Yeah, the way I think about insurance in general is just the way you said it, right? I first want to get my brain around, when I talk to my financial advisor or read or however you want to process information and say, how do I want to allocate my portfolio? How much risk? And that's a function of how much risk do you want? How much equities? How much fixed income, alternative assets, et cetera. Once I've done that, then I want to look inside of each of these buckets and say, should insurance be a part of that allocation strategy? So if I have 30% in bonds, and I think I'm going to have that for the vast majority of my life, because the conventional wisdom, you're going to have more debt, more bonds as an allocation as you get older, I'd say, well, okay, should I have 20% of that 30% or 6%, right? In a whole life structure, which is essentially better than fixed income. And we can go back in another conversation, but remind ourselves, why is whole life better than owning bonds? It's essentially if I went out into the markets and bought an 8% bond, I have to pay taxes on that. So it's worth 5 or 6% to me. In the whole life structure, they're going out and buying that same bond and they're not paying taxes. And so that arbitrage is why you're getting a better risk adjusted return owning whole life than owning a fixed income.
Very helpful.